Good evening. If you just joined us, it's Kevin Owen here in Moscow tonight. Leaders of the world's top 20 economies have gathered in St. Petersburg for the G20 summit to tackle some of today's biggest challenges. And it's a busy team we've got going for you tonight. Our team's Rory Souchet is in our G20 studio in St. Petersburg with the latest updates on what's going on in that summit. Been a good start, Rory, isn't it?
It certainly has been a good start, Kevin. Thanks very much for that. We have got a huge RT team here for the 2013 G20 summit here in the Venice of the North, of course, Russia's northern capital, that of St. Petersburg. I'm Rory Souchet. Thank you very much for joining us today. Day one of the G20, many issues being discussed today. Although there are some meetings still ongoing, it's now just after 9 p.m. here in St. Petersburg. Most of the members of the G20, though, have been shuttled off, I should say, to their champagne and caviar dinners. That being said, a productive day for day one of the G20. Of course, the G20, an economic summit, and of course, economic issues in the forefront of anything here today. The idea of stabilizing the global economy, the idea of stabilizing and stimulating developing economies as well. And just a bit earlier in the program, I spoke to RT's Anissa Nawe. She gave me the latest on the BRICS countries, members of Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. They came to the G20 for a meeting on the sidelines to voice concerns over market volatility.
They did meet today, the BRICS, on this first day of the G20 summit in St. Petersburg, and we've heard in a briefing from host Vladimir Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, just a little more about what they actually talked about behind closed doors. Of course, their main focus, how to protect their emerging economies from any fallout from the richer countries, them still suffering from the actions taken by the Federal Reserve and their quantitative easing, but also over the BRICS, many other issues are making their way into the agenda this time. Dmitry Peskov pointed out, first off, that President Obama and Vladimir Putin, of course, a lot of speculation about their bilateral relations, bilateral meeting, which we're getting at this point is almost certainly not going to happen, but still hasn't been confirmed completely 100%, so we'll see. But he did point out that Putin and Obama do have a very constructive relationship, although, of course, they do have many differences. At the BRICS meeting, the BRICS leaders talked not only about Syria and their position on that, which is that the only legitimate body that can approve any kind of action would be the UN Security Council, that countries can go ahead unilaterally and do what they like, but it will be illegitimate and it will be illegal and breaking international laws. Facts should not be manipulated to justify an attack, was sort of a sentiment that was expressed by all of the BRICS. China standing behind Russia on its position that military intervention is not the way to go when it comes to this crisis. And the BRICS countries also talked about some of the revelations that we've heard from whistleblower Edward Snowden. Of course, another sore spot in U.S.-Russian relations. The BRIC leaders basically calling the electronic snooping, the U.S. spying on them, basically comparing it to terrorism. So BRICS nations not happy about that. Certainly that, and Syria is putting a damper on this summit. They do see it as a violation of their sovereignty, really, these BRICS countries. And Brazil have, in fact, mentioned that they expect some kind of apology from the United States. So a lot of issues pushing finances, I think it's fair to say, out of the way a little bit at this summit.
Anissa, as you were saying, you bring up the subject of Syria. Any movements on that today? I know we're supposed to be talking G20 economics, but anything more on Syria, Anissa?
It's really beginning to look like the U.S. might have to go it alone. Yes, they verbally have had support from France so far. We'll know more after President Obama sits down with French President François Hollande on what exactly the French support could mean, whether or not it's just verbal. But basically, the European Union has come out and said, we don't think military intervention is the way to go. Herman Van Rompuy saying that he believes it, in fact, is not the way to go. Very straightforward. José Manuel Barroso, the president of the EU Commission, saying that political solution is the only way. Italy, high hopes for this summit, saying it's the last platform in which a possible political solution could be found on the Syria crisis. And Germany also saying they don't believe military intervention is the way to go, but they're ready to put forward support to find a political solution. So it's looking like President Obama hasn't come to the right place if he was hoping the G20 would bring him more support.
Yeah, it's very interesting. That was RT's Inisa Nawe right there, talking about how basically as Washington continues to rally war cries for some sort of military intervention in Syria, the vast majority, about 90+% of the European Union, are saying no. They are ultimately disbanding themselves from America when it comes to some sort of possible military strike in Syria. Now, all along the way, this has been going on for absolutely months, if not the past 2 years, actually, regarding the crisis in Syria. Russia and China have all the way along said the only way to a solution is through diplomacy, not through any type of military interaction. And King Jiang from the Chinese Foreign Ministry delegation here at the G20, he actually said to us earlier in the day that absolutely no action can be taken on Syria that is without, of course, a mandate from the United Nations.
China is against the use of chemical weapons by any countries, any organizations, or any individuals. And given what is reported, we believe that it is vitally important for the United Nations to conduct the investigation. Any movement has to be based on the conclusion of the investigation. China and Russia both appealing for countries concerned to be serious about the possible consequences on the use of military means without the mandate of the UN Security Council.
Now, Syria is just one of the issues that's turning into a bit of a loggerheads between Moscow and Washington, D.C., though the recent months have actually seen a roller coaster develop, the highs and lows in the relationship between Moscow and Washington, whether regarding the Edward Snowden whistleblower who was granted a temporary asylum here in Washington, or Syria, or other issues indeed. The two powers have certainly been split over that of the former NSA whistleblower Edward Snowden. Just a bit earlier in the program here on RT, I spoke to Chris Lapatina, a Democratic strategist. At the end of the day, he says, regardless of Syria, regardless of NSA and its surveillance program, and regardless of Edward Snowden, the G20, in effect right now, will truly help to heal relations between America and Russia.
You saw the president and Mr. Putin shake hands today. They're both professional politicians. They both understand that there are issues bigger than Snowden, and there are issues that the United States and Russia agree on, which are much bigger than Snowden and, quite frankly, bigger than Syria. And that relationship continues. So there's always gamesmanship between politicians, world leaders, and that initial meeting was just one of those little games that are played among leaders. And again, I don't think that's lost on the people in America who pay attention to international affairs, that Russia is part of that international coalition and a very important part. I think people in both countries understand that we work together the best we can to fight terrorism. And so some of these other things, while they are difficulties, are really a distraction.
Now, when it comes to the whole issue, as we've learned in the recent weeks and months about the full extent of the NSA spy program, not just a domestic program, but full-on worldwide spying on politicians, world leaders, and everyday Joes like yourself and me as well. At the summit here at the G20, members of the BRIC nations have ultimately labeled the whole global surveillance program as unacceptable. Brazil even wanting to hear an apology, a direct apology from officials in Washington, D.C., and even the president of Mexico believes that at some point America will have to pay.
Just recently you had a talk with President Obama, and I would say the conversation was quite extensive. Did you discuss Syria at all?
No, we talked about information and the recent revelations about the US intelligence services spying on other countries. The Mexican government called on the US to conduct a thorough investigation and figure out who is responsible and to what degree for the spying, if it really happened. So we mostly talked about the actions that his administration would take in order to make this investigation happen and clarify the issues that have surfaced recently. Many different opinions have been voiced in regards to the spying scandal, and in order to stop all speculations, the Mexican government asked for this investigation. And if the intelligence services did something that goes against international agreements or something illegal, certain measures have to be taken. There must be consequences.
Now, RT is coming to you live from the G20 summit here in St. Petersburg. The sun has gone down. Do we have any chance of the white night still lingering here for the end of the summer of 2013? Probably not likely. It's getting dark, and it's getting dark quickly. Just a moment here on the program, though, with our host of RT's business program Venture Capital, Katie Pilbeam, will be joining us in exactly 10 minutes as our live coverage from the G20 continues in a sec.
Yeah, thanks, Rory. Now, Russia's released a detailed report citing evidence that a chemical attack in Syria was carried out by rebel forces, not by the regime. The assault in question killed dozens of people near the city of Aleppo back in March. Those findings come as the US tries to convince the world that Syria's opposition has no access to chemical weapons. RT's Igor Piskunov reports.
This is a detailed 100-page long report which provides thorough analysis of the weapons which were used in that attack in Aleppo in mid-March. And first of all, it concludes that it was in fact a chemical attack. The weapons which were used were custom-made and were similar to the ones usually used by the al-Nusra, one of the most radical rebel groups with links to al-Qaeda fighting against President Assad's regime. Investigators also found traces of hexagon, which was used to release the chemicals. That is not the way it's done in the military. And also they found traces of the sarin nerve gas, which was produced not industrially but was homemade, and found traces of another chemical which was used by Western nations in the times of the Second World War. So these are the main arguments presented in this report, which do suggest that that attack in Aleppo, the chemical attack, was in fact conducted by Syrian rebels. This is actually the second time that we're hearing about this report. Russia already passed it over to the Secretary General of the United Nations back in July, but neither then or now we are actually hearing about it in international media. Basically, de facto, this report is being ignored both by world powers and international media. Unlike the 3 reports published just recently on the recent attack near Damascus, they were presented by the intelligence services of the US, Britain, and the UK, and all 3 suggest that that was a chemical attack which was conducted by Syrian authorities. A lot of media attention is currently being paid to these reports. Basically, they are in international spotlight, even though one of the key arguments in all 3 is that, they are based on interceptions of communications, satellite footage, and open source reports, which are actually YouTube videos and information from other social networks. How correct it is raising lots of questions. And another argument shared by all 3 intelligence services, pointing that it was the regime which held that attack, is that the Syrian rebels, are simply incapable of dealing with chemical weapons, something which is not proved, it's not confirmed in the report presented by Russia.
Our correspondent Igor Piskunov. Let's discuss the implications of Russia's findings with anti-war activist and journalist Don Dubar is joining us on the line live from New York. Hi, Don. Evening to you. Talking first of all then about these this latest report from Russia about what happened probably in March back in Aleppo. Is it going to make any difference to any possible strike now, though, in Syria?
The United States Congress, both houses in the past 2 days got presentations from Kerry and the staff, the Secretary of Defense and the top generals and such. And the entire history recited by Kerry neglects to mention the allegations and the hugely substantial evidence in this case that the rebels are the ones that are using chemical weapons in Syria where they've been used. So I don't know that it's going to change anyone's minds because they're simply ignoring it. I also saw on CNN this morning on the crawl that there was some offer by Russian government officials to make a presentation to the Congress that was rejected by the House Speaker, John Boehner. Now, I'm assuming again that there would be some perhaps presentation of actual evidence about the facts on the ground in Syria, because the facts that have actually been disclosed to the American public and to the Congress in public are not facts. They're argument, accusation, and conclusion. And that is the basis on which they're going to war, illegally, by the way, outside of the UN mandate, outside of the UN Charter, and not just illegally according to international law, but according to U.S. law. The U.S. Constitution makes the UN Charter, which was approved and ratified by the U.S. Congress and the President of the United States in 1945, the supreme law of the land for the United States, something that Congress cannot supersede. So this whole rush to war is illegal according to American and international law, and there's not yet really been any presentation of facts to provide a cause for going to war. And nevertheless, they're moving ahead full speed. So.
You used an interesting word just now. You used the word ignoring. You said they were ignoring facts that were available, maybe including what's come out now from Russia about what may or may not have happened in March. Why are they ignoring it, do you think?
Well, because they can. The U.S. media refuses to cover anything that contradicts the narrative that's being sold. In my opinion, the most effective thing that President Putin could do would be to hand a copy of this report in front of cameras to President Obama so that the world has to report the fact that A, this report exists, and B, that Obama received it. From there, hopefully the crack in the edifice will widen and the truth will get through to the American public.
Is there anything you've seen that America's put forward about those awful events just less than a month ago where so many people died that has convinced you who or who didn't do it?
Well, you know, I've done some television productions, and my wife and I are in the middle of producing a horror flick, which is, of course, complete fantasy. What you've seen on YouTube, of course, you have no idea who shot what where. It's sort of like Blair Witch Project, or Apollo 18, which are, you know, fake movie pseudo-documentaries. You can fake anything. You had, for the entire Libyan war, up until the U.S. Got deeply involved, these radicals, there'd be 5 or 6 guys on a dark street somewhere, shooting right into the air, screaming Allah Akbar, and they described for you in a news report what that meant, that this was proof that they had just conquered Tripoli or something. And the same kind of, you know, you have to really scrutinize these videos, look at what they are, and then understand the chain of custody. Who shot it, when, where, and what evidence do you have that that's in fact this source, and that the thing that's being described is actually what happened? There's no evidence for any of this.
The UN inspector's report, the latest one, is that going to make any difference at all?
Well, apparently the decision has been made about what the facts are. I mean, you had 3.5-hour sessions of the U.S. Congress on yesterday and the day before, the Senate the day before, and then yesterday the House, and another 1.5-hour session with the Senate yesterday. And the conclusion is what was presented as evidence. There was no discussion whatsoever about, did the government of Syria use chemical weapons, or even were chemical weapons used. It was stated at the outset in each case that that's in fact what happened, that the weapons were used, that this was an example of the weapons used, that there were 1,200 or 1,300 casualties, I forget the number, and that the Syrian government did this on the instructions of President Assad. Now, there was no discussion whatsoever about how they came to that conclusion, and there was no one challenging it whatsoever. They instead were discussing what to do as a consequence. There also was no discussion of whether or not the U.S. had the power to act without the UN, how to deal with the fact that this doesn't fall into Article 51 of the UN Charter. No discussion of that either. So, the rest of it's like watching a cartoon. It's hard to really conclude what they're going to do, other than to conclude they're going to go to war, because that's generally what they do.
Don, thanks for being on the programme tonight. Anti-war activist, journalist as you are, live from New York. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. More news, world news after the break, including an offensive launched by record labels against internet pirates.